good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. It is the morning for me as I record this, so that's the reason for the salutation as it is. You are not going to have to be looking at me on this one. I am going to automatically start sharing the screen here in a second. Just wanted to welcome you in. This is the first of the recorded lectures for 242. This is for chapter 2. And I will be grading module 1 here this weekend. I have been working on discussion boards mostly, getting those graded and back to you. So with that being said, I will go ahead and share my PowerPoint here, which says end screen. So, well, you know what? There we go. Let's go backwards, back. There we go. Okay. I use the McGraw-Hill, who is the editor for, or the publisher, excuse me, for the textbook that you use, because I feel it's a good bouncing off point. I normally make my, pardon my clock back there, I normally make my PowerPoints from scratch, but for this course I use McGraw-Hill because I feel that it does a good job covering the material. Plus I also add my own pieces to it. So it's not as if I'm just going to sit here and just read you the slides. All right. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead. We're going to be talking about life course transitions here in this chapter. And your assignment for this module is going to be one of the assignments is where you're going to be looking at your own parents' life course transitions and share with me how those transitions occurred. And yeah, so you'll be able to read that in the module. This is what information we'll be covering for this chapter. First, we're going to be looking at the life course framework and what that means. We're also going to be talking about some of the research methods that are used in any kind of research, but what's best for the field of gerontology, especially with the concept of the life course. We're going to be identifying some life course events, life course events, discussing the theory of cumulative disadvantage. The only one that we're not going to be talking about is this, how government influences the life course. I removed that slide. So, but since this is not editable, I just have to tell you that we are not covering this that little section. Let me get a little crazy here with my mouse here. Okay. A little early in the morning, obviously. Okay, so our life course framework, for some of you, you may have already taken some lifespan development courses and you may have already discussed this concept of the life course. But for the most part, in gerontology, especially in social gerontology, it is a very predominant theme. It is one that is used quite often in describing how an older adult has become the way that older adult is. And by that, I mean, what were some of the things that happened in that older adult's earlier life that caused them to go on this career path, or caused them to make the decision to have children at a later age, or caused them to make the decision to not have children. So it's those issues that kind of underpin this life course framework. So as the slide sits here and says that this is where we look at how our historical events interact with our individual decisions, the opportunities that we're given as individuals that are going to then later affect our later life outcomes. And as I said, what's the best age? I didn't say this, but the concept of what's the best age to have a child. For some individuals, the best age to have a child is early, and early being 17, 18, 19 years old. For some, having a child comes a little bit later in their younger adult life, maybe in their late 20s, early 30s, and some individuals have children in their 40s, mid 40s, as long as the maternal health is good, as long as um, it. Well, sometimes decisions are made as far as children are concerned that are beyond the control of some individuals. So this is obviously in this world of when can we plan to have children? What age should you be finishing school? Is it a normal event to see somebody who goes back to school when they're in their 70s, taking a few classes here and there, or actually going back for their degree? There's a difference. But what age should we be finishing school? Is there an age that we should be finishing school? Now, most of us will agree that the typical age to finish high school is 18, sometimes pushing into 19 years old. But now we have programs where individuals can stretch that high school degree out to being 20 years old. And that is maybe due to some circumstances, maybe due to some learning differences. But typically 18, 19 years old is when we expect to see somebody graduate from high school. So then what age do we expect to see somebody graduate from college? 22, 23 years old. And then what age do we expect to see them go into if they are going into a master's program or a doctorate program? When should they be finishing school? This is all of these little pieces that we think about in this life course framework. And this last one, when should a couple purchase a house? Some individuals don't want to purchase houses. Some want to rent for a long period of time to where they are able to purchase a house. Is there a normed time that we look at to say, you should be buying your first house by the time you are X years old? We look at the life course framework within these role transitions, and as we age, we move through different social roles. And those different social roles are going to provide us with different identities. Right now, all of you are students. Some of you may be a husband or a wife. Some of you may be a mother or a father. Some of you, while you're going through school, also might be working. These are these different transitions that we see within society that are identified as these role transitions, and they typically happen as we age. This concept of those transitions does refer to the role that changes the individual and how that role change occurs as they leave school, as they take a job, as you get married, as you have children, or as you retire. So you may be a student for some time and then you graduate. So then your role transition is student to graduate. Then hopefully at the end of graduation, you have yourself a pretty nice job, or you have yourself a pretty mediocre job, whatever the job is. Then you are a worker, you're an employee. That's your role transition. During that time, you may also get married. And for some, they may become parents. And then for some, if they become a stay-at-home parent, they then transition out of that worker role into a stay-at-home parent role. So all of these things then lead us up to this role transition of potential retirement. So maybe we went back to work after we were stay-at-home parents, and then we retire. So we go through another role transition. And these are all changes that occur when we move from one role to the next. There are counter transitions, that these are going to be transitions that are produced by others' role changes. So for example, if we are looking at a um, a set of parents who are getting ready to see their daughter or their son get married, as you can see in this picture, the role transition doesn't occur through anything that the parents did. The transition occurred through what the children did, and that is get married. So the parents become an in-law, a mother-in-law, or a father-in-law. Another situation is where the children then have their own children. And through that transition, it is not through anything that the parents have done. It's what the children have done, and that is have grandchildren. And then they become grandparents. So those are these counter transitions that we see. Pardon my dog, he's going to bark because he heard something upstairs. These are those counter transitions that are going to occur throughout these role changes. And then a trajectory is a series of transitions. So think of it in this manner. If you're looking at it as a straight line, and I'm a student and I'm on this student trajectory, I then graduate. That trajectory stops. My student trajectory stops, or my student role stops. I then transition into a graduate. I'm now a graduate and now an alumni of the college. And then I take on a position somewhere. My trajectory now with those series of transitions is I am now a worker. I am now an employee. So now I have a different trajectory. For some, the student may remain in school for a period of time. So you may have individuals that you know when you are getting ready to make a decision. Some individuals are graduating and they are getting jobs. Think in high school, if individuals didn't go off to college after, their trajectory is different than yours because you went off in a different way because you transitioned to being a college student. And then once you're a college student, then you transition into being a college educated employee. Whereas somebody who is in high school maybe went to a trade school, they're a trade school educated employee. Their trajectory and your trajectory are going to be completely different. It could be different pay wise, it could be different experience wise. So those things are these transitions all build up into different trajectories. And for those of you who have had this before, this probably is a little review for you. We look at how these transitions occur and how we are with trajectories within certain effects. And there are described in the book 3 different effects: the age effect, the period effect, and the cohort effect. So the age effect is going to be something that's going to occur as a result of somebody just getting older. Their advancing age is going to maybe produce an individual who has declining health. And that declining health can be the reason that they stop working. So the age effect of that individual's retirement is the fact that they have declining health. And the effect of that is that they had to retire early. A period effect is an impactful event. So it's historical and it impacts an entire society. At this point in time, we are in the middle of the largest period effect, and that is the coronavirus pandemic. This is an impact that is worldwide. This impacts an entire group of people, actually pretty much all of humanity. And the impact on this is going to be defined as a period effect. Another is 9/11. Within the United States, how did 9/11 affect the lives of Americans? Excuse me, I'm gonna take a drink. Did it affect you? For many of you, that was in 2001. Many of you, I have to do some hot math here. Now, you all probably were born in 2000, maybe 2001, maybe 2002. So for some of you, 9/11, this is not anything that would impact you. And really, how much would it have impacted you being 1 or 2 years old, right? However, there is an impact on society from 9/11. We have heightened security at airports with the TSA, and we may have some different security measures that were put in place as a result of 9/11. So that is a period effect. A cohort effect is one where we see a social change that occurs as one cohort replaces another. By that, I mean the silent stoic generation, a cohort in and of itself. These are individuals who were born pre-World War II up until 1945, not during the Depression. Okay, so I'll compare two generations. The swing generation is the generation that was born pre-Depression and was up until pre-World War II. So they were born during the Depression. There were many different changes that occurred during the Depression era versus the silent stoic generation, who were born during a time of World War II, but post World War II, and during a time of more optimism and a time of more the United States realizing that it could bounce back from a world war and start to enter into more of a stage of what was deemed at the time prosperity. So those social changes, if you think about, and I'll give you as an example, many of you I don't know if many of you know of any individuals who lived through the Depression, but I had an aunt, my grandmother and my aunt both were born in 1918. I think that's when my Aunt Firm was born. That's terrible memory. But anyway, they were raised during the Depression era. And during the Depression era, many individuals were taught to save and to use materials that were previously used, or make meals out of smaller ingredients or lesser ingredients. If you ever want to watch something on YouTube, watch Depression era cooking. It is an actual thing. And the thought process behind that is that the social change in between the silent stoic generation and the swing generation is that the individuals in the Depression era were more savers, scrimpers. I don't want to call them hoarders. And then the silent stoic generation were raised by or knew individuals from the swing generation, and they were also taught similar methods. But then as we get up to the baby boomer generation, and that is the individuals between 46 and 1964, who may not have carried that saving and that scrimping and the making sure that we have what we need, and getting by on less. And then my generation of the Gen Xers, we certainly were not taught that. I was taught by a parent who was a silent stoic generation who did have a little bit of that in her, as far as saving and making do. But that's not how I have now raised my children. So all of that to explain that cohort effect, where we see those changes when one cohort replaces the next and then replaces the next. I apologize for all of those sounds. My dog is just like one of those social dogs who just has to sit right underneath my feet. Cross-sectional research on aging. So this is starting to talk about the different research methodologies that are out there and what is best to use in social gerontology research. So in cross-sectional research studies, the same information is collected from people over several age groups. So if we are wanting to, we'll use my example, if we are wanting to look at the attitudes of individuals as far as consumerism is concerned, and if we can find anybody from the swing generation, that would be a great feat, actually, because many individuals who are at the tail end of the swing generation are still alive, but they may not have necessarily been alive during the Great Depression, right? Those individuals are going to be pushing, they'll be pushing 100 in about 9 years. They're out there, yes, but for the most part, if we're looking at that, from the swing generation to the silent stoic generation to the baby boomers to the Gen Xers. Let's say that that's our research study. And we're looking at their attitudes as far as consumerism is concerned and use and waste. We will do a cross-sectional study and we will look at those different cohorts. This is going to be less costly than longitudinal studies. Longitudinal studies being something that I will discuss here in just a second. We can also kind of draw some conclusions from that, where our cohort effects, we can say, okay, in the swing cohort versus the silent stoic cohort, we can gain information from the changes in attitudes to up to the baby boomers, then up to the Gen Xers, than we would necessarily have been if we just looked at the baby boomer generation. Okay. So a disadvantage, it doesn't really help to distinguish what may have been a period effect or an age effect. So those are some of the disadvantages for cross-sectional research. Then longitudinal research studies are going to follow the same group of people over time. So we're going to follow a silent stoic generation person from 1950 to 1960 to 1970 to 1980 to 1990 to 2000, 2010, a very long period of time. It doesn't have to be very long, but for a good piece of information, the longer, obviously, the better. So longitudinal research is going to be better than a cross-sectional study for distinguishing age effects from cohort effects, meaning how am I going to be able to determine that you're answering this way based on your cohort versus based on your age. So if I am looking at a longitudinal research study on exercise habits, the baby boomers, let's just say, are extremely exercise oriented and know that exercise is good for them, know that they should be doing it, know the things that they should be doing. But then as they age, right, they are going to reassess that exercise. They're going to have the mindset that my cohort, yes, we believe that exercise is important and what we need to be doing. But then as I grow older, I might not be able to exercise as easily as I did when I was 20 years old when I started this research. So you can distinguish those effects in longitudinal research as opposed to a cross-sectional study. It can also make it possible to infer that age change and the effect of living through a period across cohorts. So if I'm younger and I know that I should be exercising, I'm going to be doing that. And then as I grow older, then I can see how my age affected my attitude about exercise. Some of the disadvantages, it can be costly because you're re-interviewing people several times. People move. And when you're 20, you're not necessarily going to be in the same place when you're 50. And so you have to locate them. Many people forget that they were part of the study, or it doesn't cross their mind, and they don't notify the researchers that they've moved, or that there's been a status change, or they just don't want to do it anymore. You can also have biases as people do drop out of the study. So you might have started off with 20-year-olds, you might have started off with 150 people. But then as you get to when they're 50, then you only have 75. Well, you have to address that bias in your research project, because you've lost half of your research subjects. All right. So those are the research methods. The type of research, we have two different types. One is called quantitative, and the other is called qualitative. And the reason that qualitative is discussed in this chapter is because this is typically a good method for social gerontology to use. And these two different types of studies that are discussed here, participant observation and open-ended interviews, are used quite often in qualitative research. So participant observation is going to be that time that is going to allow the researcher just to kind of sit back and watch people. They can watch them in their natural setting, and they can sit there and they can take, as this word is used, copious, but a lot of notes on what they're observing. They can also then organize those observations to be able to understand whether they see patterns of behavior and what the decision-making process that might be the subject is going through at that time. Take the toy away from the dog. So in a participant observation study, I'm going to give this as an example. When I was in my master's program for gerontology, we discussed in our research class a research study that talked about looking at the habits and the social structure of 3 different locations mealtime. So the first one was a senior center. The second one was an assisted living facility. And the third one was a senior center, but it was a senior center in a cultural, ethnic and cultural senior center. So the process was that the researcher went in and was participant observing what was going on in these different areas. And they were looking at what were some of the things that people did when they looked for a seat to sit down at lunch. And how did the people at the tables respond to them? And the researcher observed many times where the individuals would save seats, much like high school, where we're saving seats in the cafeteria, and would also inform the person who was approaching the chair that that wasn't their chair, that was so-and-so's chair. And that there was a group A table, a group B table, a group C table, and you rarely moved from group C to group A. You had to move from group C to group B, then to group A. It wasn't a lateral move. And the openings typically occurred when there was a death, or if somebody was in the hospital for a longer period of time. They would hold the seats for the individuals if they were in the hospital for a short period of time. But after a while, if it became obvious that the individual wasn't returning anytime soon, they would allow somebody else to sit at their table. This happened mostly in the senior center. In an assisted living facility, seating arrangements were typically by partnerships. So if it was an assisted living facility with a husband and an adult, or husband and adult, really husband and a wife, then those were the noted seating arrangements. And in the cultural center, there was more openness. There wasn't the established seats as much as was observed at the senior center in the first example. So that is a participant observation. The researcher sat back and all they did was watch. And typically in participant observation, especially within the social setting, there is not any interaction. So you don't, as the researcher, insert yourself into it and make suggestions, because then what are you doing? You are going to be altering your results, right? So participant observation studies are great for natural settings and watching and observing individuals and how they react to one another. Another good participant observation study might be looking at the gender roles of 65 and over couples and just sitting and watching them as they go about their normal day and not interjecting, and just paying attention to the things that happen. Then we have open-ended interviews, and that is where we allow individuals just to explain their experiences and give us their own opinion in their own words. Open-ended interviews are great for looking at opinions in the political realm, in the social realm, in the economic realm, and just also just personal experiences. Maybe you are looking at trauma and how trauma has affected 65 and over individuals, and then so you ask open-ended questions. So these two pieces are really good examples of what qualitative research is in social gerontology. Okay, so this is a research study that was conducted by Newgarden, and it is discussing this concept of age norms, where when we are looking at what a norm is what is an appropriate age, as I talked about before, for making some life course transitions. These age norms typically form what we call a social clock. And this orders our major life events: marriage, having children, retiring. And they are continually being transformed. The next slide I'm going to show is, I believe it's my next slide. It talks about an age timetable. But I want you to think about this for a second. If we are looking at age norms and we are talking about a normed effect or a normed event, what does that mean? It's normed by whom? Because when you're talking about something that is a norm, it has to be normed by somebody. Is it normed by your family? Is it normed by your friends? Is it normed by just society as a whole? Is it normed by your school, by your religious institution? Who is it normed by? Those are the questions you have to ask yourself. If I have this whole concept of an age norm, well, who's telling me that it's normal and that my social clock is set to this when I have to think about marriage, or it's set to this when I think about having children, or it's set to this when I'm thinking about retiring? That whole concept of it continually being transformed, who is it transformed by? Is it transformed by the individual? Is it transformed by a group of individuals who believe that we should push out these age norms? Or is it transformed by society saying, you know what, we probably were pretty strict? Because if we think about the age norm of having children in 1950 and the age norm of having children in 2020, totally different norms, completely different. So that is that whole concept that they're always being transformed. So this is a 1996 study by Sederston and Heggested that is showing some of these age timetables. So this is 1996. This is pre many of you having entered the world. This is actually 1996 would have been the time that No, this wasn't 1996. When did I graduate from law school? Yeah, no, Dr. Pitt graduated from law school in 1996. So this is when I was 26. No, 24. Say it, math, me and math, not good friends. I would have been 24 at this time. Okay. So in 1996, at the age of 24, no, I wasn't 24. That's not right. Let's just go past the fact that Dr. Pitt doesn't know how old she would have been at this time. 26. At this time, average age deadlines. So deadlines. This is the time when we believed in 1996 individuals should have been doing these things. Leaving home, both male and female, age of 21. Returning home, because we had to acknowledge that those individuals did exist, 27 and 28. So for some reason or another, they may need to return home at that age. Getting married, 27 and 25, which I think is interesting that the returning home and the marriage time for men is about the same age. Parenthood, 29, 28 for women. Completing childbearing, 44, and 39 for women. Completing, being done. So a man, obviously, can, in 1996, the age norm for major life event was 44. For females, it was 39. Becoming grandparents, 52 and 50. So then we look at work and educational events. By the time that we need to exit schooling, remember when we first asked that question, when should I be done with schooling? In 1996, we said 26 for men and 25 for women. We said that a man at the age of 22 should have a full-time job and a woman 21. A man can settle on their career or their job by the time they're 29, and women 28, really only one-tenth of a month or whatever age there is difference, one-tenth of a year. Peak of work career, 41 and 39. So according to this timetable, I am way past the peak of my career. And I should be about 9 years away from retiring. So those are timetables for major life events that are recognized in 1996. All right. Oop, that is not what I meant to do. I meant to hit this. There we go. So these age timetables are were developed in this research study by Sederson and Hagestad. And a lot of the respondents who responded to or participated in this study could identify a deadline for most of those events. And that a lot of the individuals also didn't really feel that if you missed your cultural age deadline, there really wasn't a consequence for that. Okay. How long our life course events happen can be a continual transformation. We don't necessarily think, okay, I'm going to be in this for 40 years. We have to acknowledge that there are going to be things that are going to be thrown at us that may change that event for us. Okay, so the duration refers to the number of years that are spent in each phase of the life course. Parents, when you become a parent, it's not as if all of a sudden you are done being a parent. You're not. Your parental life course is from the time that you become a parent to infinity until your death, right? So the duration is continually being transformed. All right. But for the most part, there are going to be those life course events that just do not have an end date. They're just there and you're in it. There is a change in this for adolescents. So until about the 1980s, grown children were expected to get out of the house, become independent, and they were not expected to come back home. And I can attest to this. I have an older brother who is 11 years my senior, and he graduated in 1977. And when he graduated, he left the house. He left when he was 18. And although it could be some faulty memories that I have, I was only 7 or 8 years old at the time. I do recall him returning home, but just for a brief period of time. And then he got married and he was out on his own. My brother was out on his own very early, as was my sister, who is 6 years my senior. She was married and had a child, and she was out. I, on the other hand, graduated in 1988 from high school. My life course events took me from a high school graduate to being a college graduate. And in college, I met my now husband, and we were dating, and then we were engaged. I then went into law school right after I graduated from college, and we got married in my first year of, or at the end of my first year of law school. My first year of law school, I was living in a dorm at the university, at Ohio Northern University, and then I moved back home, and then I got married, and then my husband and I moved into our place, and then my husband took another job in Kentucky in the middle of my third year of law school. I moved back home to my parents' house. Talk about a major life course event. And that was because we were done with our lease, and I moved back to my parents' house. It wasn't as if I was moving back because it was expected. I was moving back for convenience, but I did. I rebounded and I boomeranged back to my house. So within the past 2 decades, we're starting to see where younger people are starting to live longer in the parental home. And then if they do leave, they tend to return home. So as you recall in this lovely little chart on 1996, whoops, right here, where we're discussing the individuals who are leaving home and then returning home. So this is just within the past couple of decades. This is not something that would have occurred back in the 1980s and prior to that. So these boomerang individuals are setting new life course events. And then also another is the extension of old age due to the increase in our life expectancy, which is a good thing, right? We might have individuals who are retired and their life course event is that they retired and they are no longer working. And now all of a sudden they are living longer lives after that retirement. Then what does their life course look like? They've lived their life all the way up until that point, and then they retire. They may have another 20 years after retirement because of increased life expectancy. And we are starting to see more of that. It is that stage of an older adult's life that we need to start studying more in gerontology, kind of that third age, which is a recognized theory, not theory, but a recognized time for older adults, the third age. Okay. The sequencing of our life course events is going to presume that our transitions should be made in a particular order. And that's a presumption that can't always be made, right? Especially with this example, that marriage should precede childbirth. Well, sometimes marriage doesn't precede childbirth. Sometimes childbirth precedes marriage. And sometimes childbirth occurs without marriage. That there are individuals who do not want to get married because even if they've had a child. Those are presumptions that we probably should start eliminating from our thought process as far as, well, now I'm going to transition into this stage of my life, and now I have to be doing this. What's the norm that's expected of me? We might have some disorder in the sequencing of our life events, and that could possibly have some negative consequences. So think about if in the middle of all of this, we had some interrupted schooling, and all of a sudden we have a baby on the way, and now we're on early parenthood. So for the most part, research has shown that interrupted schooling and early parenthood are going to be associated with lower income later in life. And we also might have some life events that overlap that are going to create some role conflicts. If you have a parent who is parenting their own child, and so they're the caregiver to their child, but then they have to become a caregiver to their own parent, those role conflicts are going to come into play. You're a parent to a child, that child needs you for specific things, but you're also a child to a parent who needs specific things. And so your role of parent and your role of child, it could cause conflict. Your role as parent and your role as worker could also create some potential conflicts, in that if you have a sick child at home, who's going to stay home? And your position as an employee is the company wants to see you at work. And those role conflicts can absolutely come into play there. All right. And I know that I'm very specific, and I'm kind of heavy on the parent-child example in this, but that's just how I chose to illustrate it. Okay. You can just read through these couple of slides. These are just some, just some information talking about what are some of the, we have to address that there are some early life experiences that are going to absolutely have an effect on our mental and our physical health. And you can go ahead and read through this. Obesity for children being one of them. Sexual abuse for women or men being something else as well. Divorce is another. Okay, so any kind of an interruption of the family relationship during adulthood or during childhood can have an effect on the mental health of the individual as they become an adult. Okay, and then a demographic change and middle age, where for a period of time there was no distinction. In the 19th century, many women had their first children when they were in their 20s. And they continued to have their children until they were about 40, which then put them into child rearing and taking care of the child up until they were about 40 to 60 years old. So if you think about that, now do we see that? Or do we now notice that there's more of a change toward that acknowledgement of middle age? And where that occurred was about the 1970s, where couples at that time were having their children by their mid-20s, and they had a total of 2 kids, as opposed to the 19th century when individuals were having multiple children and multiple children up until until they're 40. These individuals were already done having children by the time that they were in their 30s. So by the time they're in their mid 40s, their children had already left the house. So this is just kind of that concept of this demographic change of what we deem to be middle age, where middle age wasn't really existent in the 19th century, and we started to establish that middle age of your parents, and when you have launched and gone off to college and you've moved off on your own. Now they're in that middle age of their lives. And when we get to that point where we have to address the fact that there is that empty nest syndrome, and with the empty nest syndrome comes a complexity of emotions, a complexity of feelings that now we have to, as a parent, identify ourselves as somebody completely different. We are no longer needed by the child, and I'm in the middle of this. None of my children have launched yet, but one is getting close to launching, and I'm in that, okay, now who am I? Now I have to say, okay, I started off as a wife. I'm going to have to probably return to my thought process of, I'm not just the mother needed as a mother. I am now a mother who isn't as needed as much, but now I need to become more of a better wife So all of those complexities in that whole thought process occurs. And so when, you are witnessing one of your parents maybe going through this empty nest syndrome, cut them a little slack. Okay. Just cut them some slack. All right. Okay. So our final point is this theory of cumulative disadvantage. Cumulative meaning it builds upon itself. Disadvantage, obviously, that there is some inequality, that there's a lack of equality for a group of people. Over the life course, there is going to be, even within a cohort, an increasing diversity between members of that cohort. Then that's going to create this whole concept of inequality. So individuals who start off life at an advantage are going to experience increasing benefits as they age. So what happens now is that pushes up toward the 65 and over age category. There is more inequality amongst people who are 65 and over. They're the highest of that cumulative disadvantage of any age group. And that would make sense, right? Because if an individual is born at a specific advantage, and by specific advantage, I mean they're born into a family that has some means, as opposed to somebody who is born into a family that is in poverty or at the poverty line. The individual who has means is going to have means available to them. They may have a different schooling experience. They may go to private school. They may go on to a private college. That private college will then allow them to get a better job, or a job that is paid at a higher rate, as opposed to an individual who is born at a level of poverty. Because they're at a level of poverty, their schooling may be the public school system. And don't get me wrong, I am not meaning that you have to have private school systems and public school systems and that they are not equal in level of education. That's not what I mean. But for the most part, if you're looking at somebody in poverty, that public school system is going to be one that is also impoverished as far as resources are concerned, as far as programs that are available to individuals in that school system. So they're at this level of disadvantage. And then they continue to remain at that level. They do not have the ability to go on to school. They may they may start working as soon as they graduate. Some of them may not graduate from high school. So it's this concept of this cumulative disadvantage that just piles on top of one another. So then when you have an older adult, 65 and over, who has had these advantages in their lives, versus an individual who has not had this advantage, the inequality is great. You may have an older adult who is living still at the poverty level. And if we're living at the poverty level, we may be living in an area that is a food desert, that there is no fresh fruits and no fresh veg in the area, that the only store they have available to them is a convenience store, that the nearest store to them is 4 miles away, and they don't have a car and they rely on public transportation. As opposed to an individual who has had advantage, they've had healthcare at their fingertips. They live in an area where they can get in their car and go get whatever it is that they need. Healthcare being also, for cumulative disadvantaged individuals, being something that they're not participating in healthcare. They're not participating in screenings. They're not participating in well visits and checkups. And so because of that, then their health is not as great as an individual who is at an advantage. So this is this concept of the theory of cumulative disadvantage, and it absolutely needs to be acknowledged within the field of gerontology. All right, so that is it for this this presentation. And I will have this loaded. Well, it's not really going to matter. I don't need to tell you how I'm going to have it loaded because it's already loaded and you're already watching it. So anyway, The assignments are in the module, and if you have any questions as far as the assignments are concerned, or if you have a question about anything that I said in this presentation, please do not hesitate to ask. I'm actually going to go into Canvas and open up every week a discussion board where if you have any questions, you can pop in there and ask your question as opposed to emailing me. This might be able to open up some conversation. And then that also allows your fellow students to see what your question is. And the question can be about anything. If it's a question on the assignment, that might also be a question that somebody else has, or if it is something that you wanted to know from the PowerPoint presentation. So, okay. All right, I think that is all. I will be talking at you again next week in another presentation. And like I said, if you have any issues or any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out and ask. Thanks.